America won the War of 1812. Wait, no. Apparently the British won the War of 1812. Hold up. Wars are supposed to have losers, right? So, who lost the War of 1812? Oh yeah, that would make sense. The War of 1812 between America and the British is a conflict that, on the surface, makes little sense and appears to have achieved little in the end. At the time, though, war was seen by many in America as not only reasonable, but necessary to defend America's independence. It also had a much more significant impact on both America and Canada than most give it credit, changing the course of how each would develop going forward. In the case of the War of 1812, how the war ended was much less important than how it began and how it was carried out by each side. Blame for the war can mainly be placed on two factors: the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and the difference between how America and the British approached relations with each other. The Napoleonic Wars had seen a huge increase in the size of the British Navy, with hundreds of new ships being put into service. Britain maintained a policy of blockading all French ports to ensure that the French Navy could not effectively strike out or consolidate, as well as restricting French trade. Naturally, this required a massive number of ships, especially in places where the French did have warships or were attempting to build new ships. As a result, sailors, especially experienced sailors, to crew all of these ships were in high demand. A lack of sailors for the British Navy was made even worse by other competing sources of employment, in either privateers, which saw an explosion of activity during the period, or in the form of merchant ships, which often provided better wages. America, in particular, had become an important player in trade, with its shipping fleet more than doubling in size since the start of the Napoleonic Wars. Such a quick and large expansion naturally also required vast amounts of sailors to crew ships. Unable to crew all of these new ships with solely American sailors, large numbers of foreign crew, mainly from Great Britain, were also recruited to fill the gaps. For the British Navy, this posed a significant problem. Needing sailors to maintain its blockade of the French, the British were forced to fall back on impressment, essentially forced conscription to find more sailors. Now, while it was against British law to impress foreign sailors, it was, in the British view, acceptable to impress British citizens into the Navy, even if they were on foreign ships. Here is where the issues really began, due to the difference between a British sailor and one from America being hard to determine. Now, in the American view, nearly anyone could become an American citizen, even if they were not originally born in America. The British, however, viewed any sailor born British as a valid target for impressment into British service. Proving one's nationality and place of birth was certainly not easy at the time. Paperwork was not exactly consistent, and proving anything while at sea stopped by a British warship was even harder. Any sailor wishing to avoid impressment could claim to be American, but even Americans could not always prove their identity. As a result, many Americans found themselves forced into British service, in ever-increasing numbers as the war in Europe dragged on. For many in America, this was an outrage, made only worse by how blatantly the British conducted themselves, often stationing ships just outside of American ports. Once economic warfare began to take on greater importance in Europe, the situation only grew worse. Both France and Britain would attempt to hurt each other economically, declaring any neutral ship carrying goods from the other a legitimate target for capture. Both the French and British would seize American merchant ships, with the British seizing a much larger share. Angered in general by the actions of the British and outraged after several high-profile incidents between American and British ships, many began to call for war. To protect its right to neutral trade, to protect its honor, and to protect its still recent freedom that it felt was being infringed upon, America would officially declare war on the 18th of June, 1812, over its maritime grievances with the British. In the American view, war was not only warranted, but very winnable. The British were heavily invested in the ongoing war against France, and could spare little to deal with the Americans. Canada was also a prime target for American forces. If it could be captured, it would force the British out of North America completely, and while it was not a prime motivation for the start of the war, many viewed the annexation of Canada as a main goal for the war once it began. Any ideas of a quick and easy victory, however, would quickly smash into reality once the war was declared. America was simply not prepared for a war. Its army was small, and what navy it had could not hope to stand up to the British Navy for long, even with it being as distracted as it was. Hope was therefore put into America's militia that could be raised in large numbers so as to invade Canada and secure for the government a favorable negotiating position. The Canadian territories had few troops, and much of its population were French, and in the American view, unlikely to support the British. Nearly all of America's assumptions would prove to be wrong. The hasty declaration of war meant that not all U.S. troops were ready for it, allowing some British forces to strike against American positions. As it attempted to regain the initiative, America ran into even more serious problems, as it turned out that militia, by and large, are not great for offensive wars. Many refused to leave their local areas, especially those in the north, where the local states did not support the war for the most part. The lack of support from the north would hinder American efforts for much of the war, with the British even going so far as to not blockade the northern ports so as to encourage them to not support the war effort. Other American ports were easily blockaded as the American Navy was mostly contained. Privateers would be employed to attack British merchant ships, but overall the seas were dominated by the British. Multiple efforts to invade Canada failed for the most part, though British gains were largely reversed. Time became a key factor for both sides as America attempted to leverage strength, increasing the size of its army and pushing into Canada. The British, meanwhile, were seeing increasing success in Europe and were able to send gradually more forces into the fight. As it became apparent that winning the war would be extremely costly, even as America began to win more battles, both sides became incentivized to make peace. Neither side held a dominating position or had lost enough in terms of men or territory to make one-sided demands from the other. There were issues that had to be resolved, of course. The British wanted a buffer zone for Indians to protect them from American expansion, and America wanted to annex parts of Canada. Both sides would eventually drop their demands, allowing negotiations to be continued, and for both sides to agree to a pre-war status quo. No one side gained enough in the treaty to declare an absolute victory. Both America and Canada, however, would benefit in the long run. For America, the war solidified the nation's identity and sense of independence, as well as highlighting many of the flaws in its system, such as an over-reliance on a militia-based system for its army. The colonies that would one day be unified as Canada would also greatly benefit, thanks to the war helping to solidify a common identity from the many different groups that called the colonies home. For the British, the war was not overly costly, besides the temporary loss in trade with America. Defeating Napoleonic France vastly overshadowed the war in North America for the British, and with both wars ending, American ships were no longer targets of British impressment. In one way or another, in the grand scheme of things, everyone won. But then, why do I feel like I'm forgetting something? Indian tribes fought on both sides during the War of 1812, but the significant majority sided with the British. In the years leading up to the war, the British had maintained a policy of supporting various tribes as a way to block American expansion, the most notable being Tecumseh's Confederacy. During the war, Indians mostly fought a brutal guerrilla war against America, avoiding open battle. Throughout the war, both America and Indian forces committed massacres and atrocities against each other. By the end of the conflict, however, forces from the various tribes were decimated and unable to resist any further American expansion. Following the war's end, the British refused to support further Indian resistance, and America swiftly moved into the Northwest Territory, pushing the native tribes out. Even those who sided with America were no exception. If anyone can be said to have lost the War of 1812, it would be the native people of the Northwest Territory.